Good evening. I'd like to call the October 13th, 2020 work study session to order. I'd like to point out that this meeting is being hosted through live stream on our website and by teleconference for public comment. To accommodate public comment during this meeting, we've made temporary changes to the agenda that were necessitated to comply with COVID-19 directives. The clerk may have a roll call.
You are muted. You can mute or unmute yourself by pressing *6.
Councilmember Meyer? Councilmember Meyer?
I'm here.
Councilmember Purcell?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Krupa?
Here.
Mayor Brown?
Here. We'll now move to public comment. City Clerk, were there any electronic comments submitted to be read aloud for the work study session items?
No, Mayor, there are no electronic comments submitted.
Okay. Then we will move right into item 4, which is the work study item. And we have the illustrious Al Ford here this evening.
That's the first time I've got introduced as illustrious, so it's starting off really well for me already.
It's the biggest word I could come up with off the fly. So. Welcome, Al.
Mayor and council members, you'll remember that Al Ford of our office does a lot of code enforcement with the city. He's been a litigator for a decade now and has done police litigation, tort litigation, code enforcement litigation. He worked with Erica Vega and Stephanie and I to go through your code with regard to the sections on vagrancy and panhandling, street vendor permit regulations, animal control, and fireworks. And what we hope to do tonight is provide you a broad overview of what the law is, what's in the code, what some of the other cities are doing, to kind of give you a thought of maybe where you want to go in the future. We don't think tonight will be dispositive of this issue for you, but it should give you some ground for some thinking, and then we can come back at an additional session and cover whatever you like. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Al, and as you have questions as he goes through, please feel free to interrupt, and we'll do our best to answer.
Thank you so much, and good evening, Mr. Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, and council members. As Eric pointed out, this was not a solo effort. I went through this with Eric. I went through it with Erica Vega. Stephanie Gutierrez played a big role in it. And in addition, we worked with code enforcement from the city and also with the police department to find out what issues the city is facing with respect to some of the topics that Eric has already brought up. I want to start off by noting that this is not a policy presentation. And what I mean by that is I don't have the ability to tell you from a policy perspective how to deal with or get rid of homelessness, or how to deal with, from a policy perspective, fireworks or animal control. Instead, what it is a legal analysis of the city's codes, of the state law, and recommendations that we've made by analyzing the state law with respect to what the city already has. And because originally when I started this off, I thought it was going to be about just homelessness, I planned to say, this is a presentation on community concerns regarding homelessness, but we expanded that because there are more concerns than just that in the city of Hemet. So this will be community concerns generally on 4 topics, and it's going to be an analysis of the legal landscape and potential strategies that you as city council and working with city staff can adopt as you see fit. And we've already made some of these recommendations to the police department because we've been working hand in hand with them with respect to the code to find out what are some of the issues they've been dealing with. So as I said, 4 of the big topics that we're going to cover today are homelessness, sidewalk vendors, fireworks, and animal control. And the plan is to discuss the issue generally, and I don't mean that we're going to get into the specifics of what homelessness is. I'm sure we all know that. We are going to discuss, as I said, the state of the law, and also to determine whether Hemet is compliant with it, whether the code is compliant. And you'll see that there are some areas that the city is no longer in compliance because the law has changed over the past year or 2. So there are some changes that we're going to recommend take place. So homelessness. Like I said, I'm not going to talk about what homelessness is, but you know. But it is a topic that affects essentially all cities right now, all public entities. And the biggest problem is that it is not limited to one cause. It's not limited to one effect. And the impacts greatly affect different portions of the city. It impacts commercial businesses. It impacts the police department. It impacts the way the hospitals respond. So when we're looking at this, we're looking at it across multiple venues to find out essentially how we can address this from a legal standpoint, how your code already addresses it. And I started off by talking about some of the causes, and I'm going to go through this slide really quickly because, like I said, I'm sure you already know some of the causes. I did put this in there because the causes, and you're going to see there's not really one cause, will affect how you may have to deal with some of these circumstances depending on if you're dealing with a business or if you're dealing with this with respect to people camping out in front of City Hall, for example. One of the biggest causes, at least in California, is affordable housing, all right? And when I moved here from Louisville, Kentucky, and I bring that up because I purchased a house at that point for $155,000. And this is not a house that was in a bad neighborhood. We lived in a good neighborhood. It was on a small cul-de-sac, 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, large front yard, large backyard. That would get me nothing in California. 8 million low-income people pay at least half of their income for housing. And with the pandemic, things are just getting worse, right? I mean, people are losing their jobs. Lack of income leads to the inability to pay for housing. You've got changing labor markets, lack of or limited education in some respects so that people can't get the jobs to be able to afford it. You've got certain situations where people have a criminal record, and not only can they not get housing because they're unable to get a job, but they are unable to live in certain neighborhoods because the law prevents them as a result of their criminal record. And you've got health problems. And when I talk about health problems, I'm looking at it from 2 different perspectives. Health problems could be that there was an acute health crisis, and what I mean by that is something occurred in an individual or a family's life that caused them to have astronomical bills. And as a result of having to pay those bills, they have in essence become homeless because they can't afford or they have to make decisions about which one is more important. They've got to prioritize housing or cost for health. But there's a second part of the health problem, and that is mental health. I was a public defender for years before I got into, before I became a district attorney and before I started doing city attorney work. And one of the things I noticed is that a lot of the issues that you see with a lot of different people, and particularly the homeless, is that there are mental health issues associated with that. Domestic violence is another one. Survivors can escape these dangerous and abusive situations, but sometimes they don't have anywhere to go. Sometimes they also worry that these facilities that they go to are just as violent and dangerous as the circumstances that they're living. And I already talked about the criminal record and the inability of people to either be willing to rent to them, or they just can't live in those certain areas just because the law prevents them from doing it. So whenever you have a cause, we know that the next thing you're going to have is some sort of effect. And I've broken this down into 3 sort of categories of activity from an effect standpoint that can be associated with homelessness. And the first is loitering. And when I say loitering, what we mean is that there are individuals who are standing, sitting, or resting in public places. And I put public places, but as a public entity, you also have to deal with that from the same standpoint that you're getting complaints from commercial businesses that individuals are loitering in front of their businesses. You've got the issue of public living, which is individuals sleeping and camping in public places, including vehicles. How does the law address that? And is there a way that we can address that? And finally, you've got panhandling. The effects and the impacts are similar, but some of the impacts are larger. You've got loss of business. And not loss of business necessarily because businesses can't exist, but loss of business because either people don't want to bring their business to areas where there are large groups of homeless people. You've got the problem of loss of business because customers don't want to shop in those areas. You've got loss of businesses because they just don't think that they can market to certain people because the economic downturn in certain areas prevent people from being able to buy things from all those businesses. You've got loss of enjoyment of public use facilities. And what I mean by that is You have complaints from citizens that they and their kids aren't able to maybe, for example, use parks because they're afraid of individuals who are loitering or hanging out or camping, sleeping in the parks. Solicitation is a big one. Solicitation and panhandling, from my standpoint, sort of go hand in hand. Seeking or asking for money. And there are different types of solicitation. You've got aggressive solicitation and you've got passive solicitation. As we go through this presentation, I'm going to talk about the difference between the two. Because one, you can actually criminalize in certain aspects, whereas the other you cannot. That would be unconstitutional. And finally, you've got the decrease of the availability of city resources. And I mentioned a little bit of that earlier, but you've got individuals who are going to hospitals and may not be able to afford to stay in hospitals, or they have to go to the hospitals at a higher rate than other individuals because they are exposed to the elements from living outdoors. You've got an increase in trash because they're living in these public places. And you've got code enforcement and other people who have to go clean that up. And then you've got the issue of the police department having to respond to numerous calls. And those calls could be related to crime. The calls could be just citizens afraid because people are camping outside in different areas. They could be, as I stated earlier, from commercial businesses because they're losing business because of the camping or loitering. And as I said, we actually worked with the police, and they provided us with some statistics that they obtained over the last 2 years. And what they did was look at the contacts and calls that they've fielded related to panhandling for the last 2 years. And when I talk about the effect that it has on a city, 221 times that they arrived at these calls, the individual was gone. That's a wasted resource. 7 arrests had to be made. And you all know, as it relates to these arrests right now, these are nonviolent crimes. They're either not being prosecuted by the district attorney, or you've got situations where the courts are just processing them out. So they end up site releasing them. 104 times they ended up having to send the person on their way. Again, they're still responding to the situation, but partly maybe because they understand how the court system is going to work, partly because maybe the person has decided to move. They have the ability to send them on their way, but it's still a response. It's still a resource that's being expended in a particular area. It's an effect and an impact on the community because that resource could be used potentially somewhere else.
I just have to interrupt you. I'm going to just lose it up here because some of the things you're saying are not reality, because I can give you examples of many things, and I probably have 221 examples of just my own in the last year. So this is very frustrating for me, but I feel like that we're trying to not address a problem or minimize it. And I want you to go through your presentation, but this is hard for me to sit and be quiet.
Sure, and I am open to answering any questions you have. When you say you've got 221 things you can bring up, what do you mean by that?
By times when there are homeless people that are not moving on until the police get there. And I feel like we're minimizing the problems. We have business owners who have aggressive people staying outside of their business that they have to deadbolt their door during the daytime. I was just at 2 businesses this week. They have to deadbolt their door in the daytime because of the people that come in that have mental health issues, that are homeless.
And I guess I'm confused, Councilmember Meyer. This is literally the beginning of a presentation. We're just talking about statistics.
No, you said to interrupt if you wanted to, so I can be quiet.
I welcome the interruptions, but the comment was that there was a minimization. We haven't even gone to an analysis yet.
But you said that it's a waste of resources, and the people that called for help, all the people listening right now, to hear the city attorney tell us that when you called for help, it was a waste of resource, that's embarrassing.
The waste of resource is that 220 times they arrived and an individual was gone. That's a waste of a resource. It's not a waste of resource if they have to send a person on their way because it has been accomplished. The goal has been accomplished that the person is probably calling out to.
If I can interject real quick, I understand what Councilmember Meyer is saying, and I agree with what she's saying, and how it's not a waste of resource, because when the general public sees that officer arrive or do a drive-by to look for this individual, it gives the business owner or the resident a peace of mind that the police are actually out there doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Because what about the 2 old ladies that live across from me and there is somebody sleeping all night in their backyard. Their fencing is up against a hill, so they don't have a way, and they call for help, and the person leaves by the time they get there. It's not a waste of resource. That's on somebody's private property.
Correct. And there are circumstances when you're going to have the fact that the police are showing them out to be a good thing. But there are other circumstances where the police are going to go there and there's going to be nobody there. And those same officers could have been doing something else. It's not like every single circumstance.
So that's why people call my cell phone when they need the cops instead of calling 911?
I have no
Okay.
clue why the people...
No, Counsel, I think we've got the wrong spin on what we're trying to convey by a waste. We don't mean to minimize this is a real problem for the community. What we're saying is that it is unfortunate that your police department has to allocate resources to deal with this problem in the first place. We'd like to have some cure so that we can minimize the homelessness, the vagrancy incidents in town. That's one of the reasons we're trying to put this on, so that your police department can spend its time and resources following up major crimes and other things like that. We're not saying you shouldn't be sending police out to cover these calls. That's not what we mean by it. What we mean is it's detracting from their mission because we have such a homeless problem. And so we'd like to help you get at the root of what that is and see if we can minimize that.
Absolutely. And part of that is also, again, meeting with the police department, finding out what codes or what issues that they are routinely seeing and addressing us to see whether there's any way that we can modify the code so that when they do go out to these situations, it will be more helpful to them. What are they seeing all of the time? What does the law say? What are the community members voicing their complaints about? Those are the things that we were trying to address in this. And there are different approaches. One of the approaches is to have vagrancy laws. That's no longer a constitutional approach. The vagrancy laws originally just imposed punishments on a status, and that is a person was punished simply because they were homeless. We can't do that anymore. But what we can do is institute laws that criminalize conduct associated with homelessness, and Hammond has done this throughout the code. So the next group of slides are going to deal with our analysis of Hammond's municipal code and sort of look at the code to see if there's anything we would change. And again, we worked with the police department and code to find out if there are particular codes that we wanted to see whether it needs updating. The first was Section 46-4, which dealt with obstruction of streets or sidewalk. And this makes it unlawful for any person to loiter, stand, or sit in any public highway, alley, or sidewalk. The idea is that you can't hinder people from being able to freely pass, to be able to get into public buildings, to be able to walk along the sidewalk, or to essentially stand in a way that would end up annoying or harassing those persons who were standing. This is actually consistent with the law. So we didn't recommend any change in this particular case. There's also a penal code, 647C, which regulates this conduct already.
Al, if I could ask you a question on this. The phrase obstruct the free passage is kind of subjective, and to a degree that I think Councilmember Meyer was seeking to address, is that people will feel intimidated, even if the individual that they're intimidated by isn't overtly doing anything. It's just their mere presence and their appearance would tend to obstruct a person's free passage because they don't want to have that encounter. So I think this term obstruct the free passage, I don't know if there's case law on what that might be, but I'd just like to keep that in the back of our mind as we go forward, that's a critical component of this particular section.
And I can tell you that some of the cases that have dealt with this have essentially dealt with individuals being in the middle of a sidewalk, and if a person is trying to walk by, if they're in the middle of the sidewalk, that is obstructing the free passage of them walking from one side of the sidewalk to the other. Another example deals with, and I think I mentioned it briefly, if they're trying to go into a public building and somebody is directly outside, so in the way, so they can't get past them, or it's difficult to get past them as they're attempting to enter into that building. That's obstructing the free passage. But we can look at finding ways that make it more specific to deal with different circumstances. The only worry I have sometimes that when you start giving circumstances, then if a circumstance that isn't enumerated comes up, somebody, ends up pointing out, well, this isn't expressly, in your code. Maybe you didn't mean for this particular conduct to constitute it. So.
Right, and I understand the legislative intent in this is it's a literal obstruction where they can't get by. But I just didn't want us to lose sight of the implied obstruction, for lack of a better term.
And to build a little bit on what Russ said, we have, and this happens around here, but we have people that are just standing by. And that's all great until they reach out and grab some woman's necklace and take off running. So there has to be protection for citizens that are law-abiding to be able to walk freely and do what they would like to do too. So I don't know, we've got to figure out how to protect the law-abiding citizens.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And
so this has nothing to do with the person's status. This has to do with keeping the area free from any type of harm.
Which is why this is legal. This is legal. So this code, which deals with the inability of someone to block a passageway, is totally legal. What is illegal is penalizing somebody solely because of their status. Hammond's Code isn't doing that, which is why on this slide right here we said this is consistent with what the state law already is. So we can do this. Again, if we wanted to have circumstances that got more specific, we can look into that. But as I was explaining to the mayor, I would be hesitant to put in particular instances because of how that could affect you if you ever got into litigation. Hammond also has a code, section 46-6, which deals with use of public property. And it places restrictions on the use of public property, including camping, lodging, or tarrying overnight. We've analyzed this too. And I'm sure you've heard of, because a lot of places are dealing with this now, the Martin versus City of Boise case. And essentially what it did was say, you cannot criminalize, again, those key words, the status of homelessness when there is not sufficient shelter in the city. And so as we look at this code, there are obviously individuals who are homeless who are going to be camping, lodging, or tarrying overnight. I've talked to code enforcement and police who've had to deal with this issue. So you've got options as it relates to your code. The code has to be changed, because as it stands right now, it's overbroad. So you've got some options. Either you remove that section, camping, lodging, or tarrying overnight, which I don't recommend, or we can attempt to incorporate the language from that case. So it was very specific. It says that you can't criminalize camping or individuals sleeping overnight when there's sufficient shelter in the city. So an option that you can consider is to add that language to the statute or to the code that you already have to specify that it is unlawful to camp, lodge, or tarry overnight when there is sufficient shelter in the city. That way, you're getting around the problems that the cities faced in that Boise versus Martin case, where they were criminalizing the conduct no matter what, whether there was an analysis about whether there was sufficient shelter or not. A third option is to add a penalty section that says violation of this section will not result in criminal prosecution. And again, that probably gets you around Martin versus Boise because that only dealt with criminalizing homelessness or sleeping, camping in public places when there wasn't sufficient shelter. They didn't discuss what would happen if it was, for instance, an administrative citation or if the individual wasn't arrested and prosecuted. All it dealt with was the criminalization. Now, I've attended some conferences on this, and you'll get different perspectives. The perspective of individuals who are advocating on behalf of the homeless is that Martin versus Boise is broad enough to apply to circumstances even when there isn't criminalization. My perspective is that's not what the case said. It's very specific that it dealt with criminalization, and it only dealt with that criminalization when there wasn't sufficient shelter. So you've got a couple of options to consider as we look at modifying the code, because it has to be modified as it stands since it's a little bit broad right now.
What is the court's definition of sufficient shelter?
So what they did is essentially said that you have to have a bed for every person that is homeless in that city. And that is a tough situation for most cities to deal with, right? I mean, how do you even do those kind of calculations? One, it's going to vary from day to day, right? Second, if you have a situation where you say, well, we've got a bed for this particular person, surely we can enforce our code. Well, that's not what the law says right now. It says you have to have sufficient shelter for all those people. It's not person-specific. It's overall. And if you don't have that overall shelter, then that person is going to fall under the gambit of Martin, and the enforcement in that particular case is going to be unconstitutional.
I was going to take it a little step further and say, did the court define the words sufficient and not with shelter added to it?
It did not, no.
Because you
Only,
can have,
only in the sense of matching the number of beds to the
Correct.
number of homeless. That's as far as it goes.
So are these free beds in
Free
them,
beds.
or is it hotel rooms?
No, well, the court didn't say where the beds had to be. They have to, or how much they cost, or whether you can't charge the homeless person for the bed. that would be a concept.
you've got, well, wouldn't the equal protection clause apply that if I have to pay for a bed, the next person should have to pay for that bed equally?
Not as it stands today. We have not seen a case that supports that kind of reading of the Equal Protection Clause. However, there is still room here for the alternative approaches that you've seen with homelessness more and more since the Boise case came out, which involve interaction, movement, teams going out to try to place people. That's a non-criminalization that might reach the same effect. I mean, let's face it, what do we want? We want homeless people not to sleep in the park. We want them not to disturb the lawful abiding citizens in the city. And so certain things we won't be able to criminalize, but we have to find an alternative way to do that, such as sending the police's engagement teams out, moving them along, placing them with services, and being more interactive with them. Or we can do an administrative process. Administrative processes aren't as effective with homeless people because they rarely show up and pay their fines or anything like that. But it is another engagement tool.
Wouldn't the alternative be that we keep the no overnight sleeping in the park, in public spaces, or what have you, on city property or whatever, and you're not criminalizing homelessness in a sense. You're just not allowing them to sleep wherever they want, and gives the police the tool to be able to move people along and say, you can't sleep here, you have to leave. You're not arresting them for being homeless, but then once they refuse, it now becomes a trespass, and now you have other.
Yeah, that would lead to problems under Boise if we said you have to move and then switch to a trespass. But you can move them and subject them to some other non-criminal procedures. And I think that's what we're advocating here, is that we've got to modify the language. Yes, ma'am.
So I have four kids. 3 of them are boys. So if my boys decided to get their tents out and go to Weston Park tonight and spend the night, they could do that according to this law?
Yeah.
Awesome.
So basically, Boise nullified any municipal code that sets park hours. So most cities will say city parks are closed from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. So cities have no ability to set time frames on public parks.
And that's the question, right? Can cities not set time frames for public parks anymore? That wasn't answered in Boise. Boise was very specific towards just criminalization of camping. One of the things that was brought up or mentioned was trespassing laws, right? And you're not necessarily, you're not actually criminalizing camping, you're criminalizing trespass, which is a different situation. If you have specific hours for a park, you may be able to use the trespass laws to do it. I can't say that you absolutely can, because it wasn't addressed in that case. Boise dealt more with somebody, say, camping out in front of City Hall. That's a situation where there's not necessarily there's hours that the building is closed, but there's still access to that area. It's not like somebody's jumping over a gate, to get there, or they may be in different circumstances. What do you do in that kind of situation? Well,
so the focus is on the criminalization. It's not on park hours. You can close your public facilities. What it says is if somebody's trying to camp in your park, you can't charge them with a misdemeanor or an infraction. That doesn't mean that you can't move them or tell them that the park hours are closed. But you have to do it in some way that's not a misdemeanor or an infraction or a felony. And unless there's a separate occurrence of the infraction, misdemeanor, or felony, they're engaged in vandalism or something of that nature.
right.
The other thing that I can add here too is it wasn't too long ago, about a year ago, that there was a pretty substantial case out of Orange County that had to do with a lot of the cities out there and their desire to clear out, I don't know how many hundreds of people through the Tin Ann River thoroughfare. And they called that that settlement agreement kind of the most comprehensive homelessness package in the state of California. That did allow the police to essentially enforce some of the, whether it's loitering or other nuisance type laws, but had to require an entire program associated with getting homeless individuals housing and making sure that there were interactions that were going on between the governmental agency and then the homeless individuals as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the, it's actually, and thank you, Steve, that's actually one of the slides we had up here. It's a little bit further on. But when we looked at what other cities are doing and what other places are doing, there are a couple of unique approaches, and it's further on, so I'll just talk about it now, even though we're going to get to it. Several cities in Orange County attempted to essentially move them from along the Santa Ana Trail, the riverbed. They moved the homeless, and they moved their belongings. And as a result, the ACLU filed a class action lawsuit against every one of those cities that were involved. That's one thing that was done. So one option that they thought was just to move them. Also in Orange County essentially attempted to give one-way tickets to other cities. So that you weren't in that city anymore, they were somewhere else. And as you can imagine, those cities end up filing lawsuits and also requests for injunction to deal with that. As the city manager said, what resulted from those Orange County cases are limitations and essentially a reiteration of the holding in Boise, which is you can't just move them because they're there. This is a problem that you have to find another way to deal with. And really, it's as Mr. Vail pointed out, it's the criminalization of camping or tarrying or lodging that's the problem. That specific act. If you've got trespass or loitering, those are different situations, and I think that you can use the laws associated with those to address those problems.
I have another question for you. You talked about teams going out, and we have teams across the city who go out and try to, besides our ROCKS teams, there's lots of nonprofits and groups that go out and work with homeless people. So the other night at the bank, there was two dudes behind the trash can I stopped and talked to. I found them a place to go. I go back the next day when we had a meeting time, and they're not there. So we have places, and so how can we not enforce things if we are actively trying to get people off our streets?
If there are beds where homeless people can go, then the city needs to be able to document those and demonstrate that they're going to be available. If we can do that, if there are in fact those beds, whether they're in a shelter, whether they're in some kind of charitable place, whether they're made available through...
But there has to be 100.
we'd have to show that number of
And
beds,
see-
or something equivalent to what our homeless.
Because the point is that, I mean, I have some officers that make jokes with me that, hey, one of your buddies had your card. And it's because they have a way out. And we can't force them to choose it. So, but we can enforce them to follow rules that the city has.
Another important point is, Boise didn't say they actually had to go and stay in those beds. The city just had to show that the beds were available. You can't make somebody do it necessarily.
Right.
But if we can demonstrate that there are a sufficient number of beds, and the homeless count is a difficult thing to get a handle on. So maybe an alternative is we start with documenting a certain number of beds, and we know that that's
Right, because if I have 5 beds that I can't fill because they won't say yes, I'm not going to pay for 100. Right? So that could be argued in court, I suppose, if somebody wanted to push it.
Well, we'd like to avoid that, but having some beds available would give us some argument that we can move some people.
So if the groups that have these beds that are made available to homeless, if they were able to give like a weekly report to, say, the Rocks team, since they're the ones that go out and handle these homeless situations, then we would have a leg to stand on.
You have more of a leg to stand on.
Yeah.
But recall, this has to be on a day-by-day basis. So let's say you get a report on Sunday of how many beds there are, and then on Wednesday we do an enforcement where you end up criminally charging somebody. You have to show that on that Wednesday there was still enough beds in the city to be able to house the number of homeless that you have in the city. Again, having the information absolutely helps out. And there's no way we're going to be able to do that every single day, but if we've got these teams that are going out there, if they decide to do a particular enforcement, one of the things that they may want to start off up front is contacting these places to find out how many beds that there are. Because then when you go out to do the enforcement, you already have that in your back pocket that we know that there's sufficient shelter to be able to house these people.
We have several on our community outreach team now that has been on our homeless outreach team and all that are willing to keep beds just for the city. But we've got to engage with these people, and we don't, but we need to be able to say, like, we're going to have you keep this many beds. There's several organizations that are willing to do that, but we've got to draw something up. It just can't be.
That's exactly right. And if we could just document that there are 2 beds at this, I'll just say church, and 2 beds at this shelter, and 2 beds at this hotel, that's going to be a list of what we have available that we could utilize. Right now we don't have that.
We don't have it by choice because I've been trying.
Can't speak to that. If we've got beds out in the community, we can certainly put together a document that shows where those beds are.
I think, going back to the outset of this study session and presentation, we said going into this that we're not here to try to solve this tonight. I think what we do, as ideas come up, we capture those ideas, we come back and see if any of those can materialize into something beneficial. And I don't want to cut any council member discussion off at this point, but we're more than a half hour into our study session, and we have a lot to cover still. So it's council's choice if we want to come back and visit this at the end of our regular session. That's fine, whatever council's preference is. But I think we need to keep moving and just capture the ideas. There's a lot of good ones that have come up already.
And Mayor, we can always break this up into topics and bring them back to a series of work studies if that works better for the council.
And I think that's probably what's going to have to happen given how far we are in right now to this, which is just a couple of slides, and how far we are timeline.
Let's roll it along.
We'll try. So the next section is 53-2, which again deals with sleeping in public places. The intent is that people can't block access to the entrances or exits. And we sort of talked about that already. One of the things that we recommend is that we would change the title to personal conduct in public places instead of focusing on just the sleeping aspect of it. And we could, again, remove the offending language there, which is inconsistent with Boise, or we can add the clause when there is sufficient shelter in the city, which it sounds like that a lot of what the conversation we talked about before centered around. Or again, this Boise really dealt with the criminalization. So if you had a section that says violation of this section will not result in criminal prosecution, you would also avoid running afoul of the Boise case and having an unconstitutional practice. We also looked at section 53-3, which deals with use of a vehicle for human habitation, and essentially what it says is you can't sleep in your car. We're going to come back to this, but we have a section that addresses camping, just generally overall, both public and private. And we outlined how we think those should be separated. Right now they aren't. And part of that is addressing camping in vehicles, because whether the people are in vehicles or whether they're in public places, it's the same idea in Boise. And there's also a separate case that deals with whether you can prosecute people for sleeping in their cars. 53-6 deals with obstruction of entrances to public places, makes it unlawful to obstruct the entrance or exit. And Ms. Mayor, I think that's what you were bringing up. We've analyzed this, and this is consistent with the law. No changes that we recommend for that, so the city can continue to enforce that. 53-8 is the city's camping section, is the one that's going to need to be modified or changed because of Boise. And what it says is no person shall camp anywhere in the city, whether it's on public property or private property, and then there are different exceptions that are listed within the code. Included in that is an exception that deals with cars. And you can sleep in a car, but you can't do it a certain amount of times. So no matter how you look at it, not only does that interfere with Boise, where again you're criminalizing the homeless for essentially camping in a public place, but there's also this case called Desert Train versus City of Los Angeles. And what happened in that case is that, again, you had a homeless individual who was sleeping in a car. They went to prosecute him as a result of that. And what the court says is that you may be able to do some prosecution for people sleeping in cars, but you have to be very specific. You can't just say people can't sleep in cars. You have to specify what hours they can't sleep in cars. You have to specify what you mean by sleeping in cars. What kind of conduct are we talking about? Is it applying to whether somebody takes a nap or is it a long amount of time? Hemet's Code doesn't do that right now, so those are modifications that you're probably going to want to have to make in order to be in compliance with both Desert Train and the Martin v. Boise case.
You refer to vehicles. What about specifically RVs, motorhomes, campers?
Well, those are a little bit different. So the city already has codes that are addressing that. When I'm talking about vehicles, they're referring to cars specifically. So not RVs, not motorhomes, not mobile homes, which are addressed in different part of the code. This is just for cars. So again, we've got options. In this particular case here too, you either, again, add a section saying this is not going to result in criminal prosecution, or you do a combination. You can restructure section 53-8, separate it into two different subsections, which is camping on private property and camping on public property, and address those two things independently. And here's one of an example that we recommend. You got private property. You can say no person shall camp. You specify the amount of days. And you also have a clause for when it won't apply. So if people are on their own land, if there's written consent from the person whose property it is. Private property is probably not the biggest issue you have with respect to camping, unless it's somebody who's trespassing on private property. The bigger issue that you have is the camping on public property. And one of the ways we recommended restructuring the city's code is to essentially say that it is unlawful to camp upon any public property, and we list out the different things from specific hours. Because what Boise dealt with was sleeping essentially overnight. So if we've got a situation where individuals are sleeping during the day, we may still be able to enforce the code. And you also have a clause that gives you a little out, because you can say, except as may be permitted within municipal parks by the city manager. It gives individuals the ability, if there are groups that want to camp in the park, to contact the city to have sort of a way around the outright ban on camping at nighttime in the city. So we looked at what other cities are doing. Well, there are several cities that have simply not updated their code, but they refuse to enforce it because they don't want to be the city that ends up being dragged into court for violating the Constitution. You've got other cities, and I'm going to combine Coachella and Colton, that essentially say it's unlawful to camp or store personal property, but they give the broad exception, which says, except as allowed by law and except where camping is a necessity. That's essentially encompassing what is said in Boise, right? Because Boise is the law, since it's the Ninth Circuit opining and sort of making a holding on what's constitutional and when it's constitutional to camp. Reading did what we're recommending, which is they set specific hours. So it's unlawful to camp between X time and this other time unless there is no available shelter in the city. And I think that a combination of those two things accomplishes what you want. It prevents people from camping out during the day when you would normally have people who are trying to use some of those facilities like the parks. It prevents you from running afoul of Boise, and it also forces you to get around it by ensuring that there's no available shelter within the city. And if we've got these teams that can go out, and if we've got these different places that can say that they have a certain amount of beds, then it shouldn't be a hard thing to sort of do and then incorporate into the code.
And now that allows the city to criminalize.
That's correct.
If we can do that element.
Yes. And that was one of the questions, like, well, we can't do anything. Well, sure we can. If we can establish those elements, if we can modify our code to come into compliance with Boise, then we can actually criminalize the conduct as long as it's in violation of a code that is now legal. This is the lawsuit that the city manager was talking about. You had a lot of individuals that were it's one of them. There was a lawsuit that was filed alleging that several cities, Orange County and Laguna Beach, they were transporting all of their homeless to Santa Ana. And the suit is still going on, but essentially there is an injunction that was pending last time we checked. Say, hey, you're essentially affecting our resources when you're giving these people one-way tickets to our city. And now we have to account for the number of homeless there and have to attempt to make sure that we have enough shelter to house them there. There was another situation, and this is actually the one he was talking about, where there was a huge lawsuit in Orange County. And it didn't just involve the county, it involved several cities. And Orange County made the decision to remove, there were hundreds of people that were lining the trail. They filed a class action lawsuit regarding the process, and it was a huge settlement that came out of that. The settlement essentially required that they comply with Boise, that if they're going to remove some of their personal property, which was a big issue in that case, that they ensure that there are due process provisions that, enable the individuals not to just have their personal property thrown away.
It was very expensive because it also involved a plan to contribute to homeless shelters within the Orange County area.
And, a couple of months ago, I attended a budget meeting here. I know that one of the things that I know Councilmember Meyer and also Councilmember Percival, you pointed out was you want your city attorney's office to be able to tell you ways to not have a lawsuit, right? I mean, what's the status of the law so that you are preventing yourself from dealing with some of these issues? Well, this is one of the ways. And I look at it, that's the point of the study session, to say, what does the code say now? What is the status of the law? How can we develop plans within that gambit of the law but still accomplish things that are going to be beneficial towards the citizens that live in the city and also the businesses that are here now? Storage of personal property in public spaces. Section 53-9 essentially says it is unlawful to store personal property, including camping, paraphernalia, in any public place. Generally, the language itself isn't problematic, but there's no due process requirement. And in Levan versus City of Los Angeles, that's essentially what they said is, if you're going to remove and take away certain paraphernalia, you've got to have a process for it. You've got to have pre-removal notice. You've got to have storage and disposal notice. And essentially, you have to allow for removal and destruction of personal property in situations where the storage of that property could be an immediate threat to the health and safety of the public. So, for instance, if somebody was burning or cooking in the middle of the sidewalk, clearly that's going to be an immediate threat to the health or safety of the public, and you don't have the same restrictions that you have if you had, for instance, a shopping cart with a bunch of personal property and you just decided to take that and discard all the materials. You have to have a due process thing. So we don't want to change the language, we just want to add another clause.
Council, you might remember that we've, since 2012, have done this administratively. We've worked with the police Steve McEwen of my office worked with the police team to develop this procedure. We decided at that time we didn't want to amend the ordinance. You'll remember that this is why that there is a number of storage bins out at the public yard that have this kind of material. So we think that we've been doing this administratively. Our recommendation here is if we really want to try to avoid something, we add that to the ordinance, but that's something we can talk about.
The next section deals with solicitation and panhandling. And what I mean by that is seeking immediate donation of money or other items of value from the general public. And there are two types, as I stated in the beginning. You've got your passive solicitation and you've got aggressive. Only the aggressive solicitation is illegal. And generally, that is defined to include immediate requests for funds. There's usually some verbal or physical threat, or you could have a persistent request following a negative response from the individual. You've got those types of situations, that is an aggressive solicitation. If you just got a person standing aside, it's going to be considered passive solicitation, and you're not going to be able to criminally charge those individuals.
Correct me, if you can go back to the last slide.
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but when you ask somebody for money with force or violence, isn't that become robbery?
You know, I don't have the elements for robbery in front of me. I would imagine that if you...
The police chief back there nodding his head yes.
I'm always hesitant to say yes or no when somebody asks me a question that's going to involve elements. It sounds like it to me. I would imagine so. But verbal threats doesn't necessarily have to be give me your money or I'm going to shoot you. Somebody could just be intimidated by the things people say. They could say something in a hypothetical that can come off as in a threatening manner. That's aggressive solicitation.
I have a question for you too. What about following a woman and her two kids to her car?
Aggressive solicitation. Again, they're not passively non-mobile, just holding something out saying, you know, please give me money. They're actually actively engaging with another person to get it. That's considered aggressive solicitation.
Stepping in front of you, stepping closer into your privacy envelope, following you, asking you repeatedly after you said no, even if it's, hey, no, come on, give me some money. If there's any suggestion of violence, then that can either be an assault, or if there's a touching, then it's a battery, and, you know, somebody should call the police.
But here's the thing. So you call the police, and the person's gone by the time they get there. And not because they came slow, but because they know you called the police. So then that ends up on that other list that we talked about earlier.
So you've got two cases that dealt with solicitation, and I'm going to walk through them briefly. ACLU versus of Nevada versus City of Las Vegas essentially says that you can, both of these cases, I'm just going to address this, we don't have a whole lot of time, is that you can ban aggressive solicitation, but if you do it, you have to do it across the board. You can't just ban certain types of aggressive solicitation and then not ban other types of aggressive solicitation. It has to be consistently applied. And that's the whole thing essentially in those two cases. Definitions. Hamid's Code talks about what solicitation is. We've analyzed the code. The code only bans aggressive solicitation as it stands. Does not ban the passive solicitation that we talked about, which would be unconstitutional. So we have no recommendations for this because what you're already doing is consistent with the law.
Question. I think there's a common perception that if they're offering you a service, you pull into a parking lot and they come out, they've got a squeegee and a bucket of water, and they're going to clean your windshield for you. There's a perception that they're offering you a service in exchange for that. So that doesn't technically meet the definition of panhandling, right or wrong?
I think that's incorrect. I think that would still fall within the definition of aggressive solicitation if the person says no.
Thank you.
And I'm not saying that that's 100%, right? But that would be the way
Well,
I would interpret it.
I think if you said no,
Correct.
and they keep, squeegeeing your windshield, that's certainly aggressive.
Correct.
Okay.
Especially if they're in the right of way.
So what other cities do? When we look at Paris, Paris is prohibiting solicitation on meetings, and also in situations, really private areas where they have posted premises. Riverside prohibited on private property, again, where it's posted or you have a communication to the solicitor that they don't want to essentially provide them with money. There's also time restriction within Riverside's code. It says there's no door-to-door solicitation between 8 a.m. or after 7 p.m. And that's us concluding dealing with homelessness.
Council members, I wanted to touch on the Riverside's prohibition on door-to-door solicitation. I've resisted having anything like that in our code because it actually suggests that you can do door-to-door solicitation at those other times. And I don't know that we want to give those sort of implied references in our code.
But we do have door-to-door solicitors.
You certainly do. We could limit the time, but then
Right.
once you do that, it almost legitimizes them coming at other times. Mayor and council members, we have 3 more sections we can go to at your pleasure. We can complete those on another day, or we can wait till the end of your meeting and pick back up.
Council preference?
Section at a time and see how far we get.
Yeah, because this next one's going to take some
Yeah.
time. There's a lot of new issues that are coming up with the pop-up restaurants and food service and whatever.
And I think that's going to take another hour for that one.
Exactly.
Yeah, I do think that one is particularly timely. I don't know about my colleagues on the council, but I've received a number of emails specifically related to sidewalk vendors and also some phone calls. So that's a hot button topic right now that I think we would do well to take up sooner than later.
I want to give us some things to think about on the homeless stuff before you close. Can I do that real fast?
Sure. We still have 3 minutes.
I'll try to make it fast. I feel like so part of this is criminalizing or not criminalizing makes a big difference. And if there's a way that we can have some sort of enforcement without necessarily criminalizing, and I know this is all crazy, but you look at the things that our police officers have to go through. So say that they have to arrest somebody, and then, and we're dealing with a population that is not compliant anyways. So then we are building warrant after warrant, and we're creating more paperwork, and who's that falling on? The city. So if there's a way for us to think creatively on how to have rules that we can address with even the different organizations in town, there's many, right? So that it's not necessarily criminalizing, but then we still have rules. And I think that might work a little bit more in our favor. I mean, these people have social issues anyways. So, I don't know, we need to just do some research and think about that, because talk about undue burden. We are putting it all on us, and it probably costs us to book them and costs us to all the things that happen. And there's got to be a way to be able to handle these situations and then provide opportunities. Because, you think about like a rebellious teen, and you tell them that this is our way or the highway, that doesn't always get through to that kid. And so I think that providing some, humanitarian efforts here might go a long ways. So you might have to be creative.
Absolutely creative. And then having something that you can actually have some teeth in, and then getting that word out. Some cities have done it, and there's a network out there that says, if you're going to do this, don't go to that town. Vista has done it, with homelessness. You don't go there, because if you do, you're going into the program that city is mandating. And I think we do the same thing here.
Well, we got through quickly. 1/4 of what we intended to undertake here. Would council want to take this particular topic, because it is a significant one that's impacting us, and address it through an ad hoc committee approach.
I think would probably be to get through the ordinance part of it on maybe streamlining some of our ordinances, maybe taking actions from the city attorney, but also looking at what ordinances we could get rid of and then or replace. I think that might be, and maybe for all of them, because there's a lot of them are going to be interrelated, kind of.
Well, I think I can presume that you took the same approach for each of these topics. So you talked about what is the current status and what are other cities doing, and then you have recommendations that spin out of that. So if you took that same approach, would it be beneficial time-wise to do as Councilmember Percival is suggesting, to do a task force walk through and have the task force come back with the details? Or do you want to continue to do it open as a council?
I think open as a council is good because I think we all have different ideas, and the things that you see and the things that he sees and we all bring to the table are like, fitting reality into ideas.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, I want to still hear the rest of these presentations.
Some of them might.
Mayor and Council, I would say that it would be particularly helpful to have an ad hoc work with my office and the police chief's office with regard to building this list. I think we're going to be looking at it in an expanded and broader way than many cities have looked at it. I think it might require direct council insight and suggestions on where we might look at these beds and how we come together with a list, and then we could talk about whether or not it's going to meet legal muster under the Boise case or not, and then you could bring that back and present that to council.
Well, I think maybe a hybrid approach, because I agree with Carly. I think we all need to hear the full scope of the walkthrough, and then after we've done that, if we want to set up an ad hoc to go do what you're suggesting, Eric, would make sense, and then that ad hoc could bring back recommendations.
They have 4, right? I mean, like, I'll be on the homeless one, and somebody else might want to be on street vendors, and somebody else might want to be.
We could decide that. I think we all would benefit if we go through the whole presentation, whether we do it, this evening or we bring it in smaller bites at future meetings. But then after we've done that, then we can take a look at either breaking it into several ad hocs or one ad hoc to deal with all of it, or one ad hoc to deal with a couple of them. Whatever falls out, I think would be reasonable. And I do think it's worthy of our time to come up with, because this is such a difficult issue to address. Community expectations are high. The law doesn't always support what the community would like us to be able to do. So being able to go through and take a fresh look with case law and legislative laws and then marry those together, I think is worth our time. So, well, thank you for getting us started. Appreciate that, Al. And with that, I will recess the study session, and it's now 7:03 p.m. So we'll go into our regular session. So good evening. I'd like to call the October 13th, 2020 regular City Council meeting to order. I'd like to point out that this meeting is being hosted through live stream on the city's website and by teleconference for public comment. City staff is at an off-site location participating through video conference. If you're joining through teleconference, please mute your phone to prevent noise interference until your opportunity for a comment. Due to the structure of this meeting, I'd like to remind council to have their microphones turned on and positioned so the audience can hear. City Clerk, may I have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Meyer?
Here.
Councilmember Percival?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Krupa? Mayor Brown?
Here. That brings us to our invocation tonight. The Interfaith Council representative, Rhonda Trutzman, is here, after which Councilmember Percival will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand.
Thank you. So as we turn inward this evening, let us turn to that God of our understanding, that we accept as a community that everything done here tonight is for the highest good of the citizens of Hemet. We know that the City Council is creating for all of us a harmonious living and working environment that continues to grow and to prosper. I give thanks for all that is and all that will be, as I know it to be so, and so it is. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our nation's flag. Ready to begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. You may be seated.
Thank you. Moving on, item 10, communications from the public. We have a temporary 2-minute per person time limit for all general public comments on non-public hearing items. All who wish to speak, including council members and staff, need to be recognized by the mayor before speaking. Members of the public shall comply with the adopted rules of decorum, Resolution 4545, a copy of which can be requested through the city clerk's office. You may also fill out a form and submit your comments online at www.hemetca.gov/councilchamberlive, and those comments will be read aloud. However, submittal must be done before 2 p.m. the day of the meeting. For those of you joining by teleconferencing, you're able to do so by dialing 888-585-9008, and when prompted, you dial 768-176-038. You'll be asked for your name prior to speaking. And a reminder, if you are joining by teleconference, please remember to mute your phone to prevent noise interference until your time to provide your comments. When you're called on, please state your name and the item that you're commenting on before speaking. At the conclusion of communications from the public and public hearing item, the public teleconference line will be deactivated. The public is still encouraged to watch the live stream at hemetca.gov/councilchamberlive. So item 10A, public comment for items listed on the agenda, consent and discussion items. City Clerk, do we have any electronic comments submitted to be read aloud?
No, Mayor, there are no electronic comments.
Are there any members of the public participating through teleconference who would like to comment on any consent or discussion items?
At this time, there are no members of the public on the line.
And do we have any speaker slips on consent or discussion items?
There are no requests to speak.
Okay, moving on to item 10B, public comment for items not listed on the agenda, but within jurisdictional matter. Were there any electronic comments submitted to be read aloud for non-agendized items?
Yes, Mayor, there were 2 electronic comments submitted. The first one is from Patricia Ann Gregory. The comment states, I would like to know why the City Manager and the Measure U Committee have violated Prop 1918 that requires an annual audit of Measure U. Their agreement to 2 years of an AUP after 4 years of Measure U is an insult, as an AUP provides less detailed financial information. And Ms. Krupa and Mayor Brown need to address their refusal to adhere to their promise regarding Measure U and Resolution 4731. We now have less sworn and unsworn police officers today than prior to Measure U. End of comment. Next comment is from Andrew Foster. Reads, Dear City Council, my name is Andrew Foster, and please stand with me and the people of the city to defend equality under our Constitution and reject State Measure 16 in the November election. State Measure 16 would amend our state constitution and allow the state government to discriminate between Californians based on race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. Californians overwhelmingly reject State Measure 16. A poll of 1,704 California residents released on September 16 by the Public Policy Institute of California showed voters opposed to State Measure 16 by huge margins. 80% of voters have decided how to vote, and 60% voters who have decided are opposed to State Measure 16. Californians in every area of the state reject State Measure 16. The polls show 53% of Los Angeles and 55% of Inland Empire voters who have decided how to vote or oppose to State Measure 16. Elected officials, please join us in defending California's unity and equality by opposing State Measure 16. Don't divide us. Don't amend our Constitution to allow the state government to discriminate between Californians based on race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. End of comment. And there are no other electronic comments.
Okay, are there any members of the public participating through teleconference who would like to comment on any non-agendized items?
Hello?
Hello?
Anybody there?
Yes, are you wishing to have a comment on a non-agendized item?
No, I wanted to make a comment on an agendized item.
Well, we are past that.
14C.
Did you just now come on the line?
Hi, my name is, can you hear me?
Yes, did you just now come on the line?
Okay. Yes, I am.
Okay, we are...
My name is Ann Smith, and I live in the city of Kemet. And I have a question about item 14C. I have a question about item 14C. Why do we need a supplemental disbursement from...
Hold on, Ms. Smith, just for 1 minute. We have an audio problem and we're going to try to troubleshoot. I do want to point out that we are past the item on the agenda for commenting on agendized item, but in light of the uniqueness of our circumstances trying to comply with COVID directives, I will grant you an opportunity to speak on your item as soon as we get the technology issue resolved. Okay, Ms. Smith, are you still on the line?
She just left the line. She hung up.
Let me try. Okay. So are there members of the public participating through teleconference who would like to comment on a non-agendized items?
There are no other members of the public on the line.
Okay. Do we have any speaker slips wishing to speak on non-agendized items?
There are no requests to speak.
Okay. Go ahead.
And she's not on the line at all. I was just saying if she could hear any of this, if she could send an email with her question on 14C, we're not going to get there for a while. But, I mean,
Yeah.
technology should not be limiting her from asking her question.
Yeah. So, Ms. Smith, if you're still watching the live stream, I don't know if you heard Mayor Pro Tem Krupa suggest that if you can send us an email with your comments, we'll be happy to take them. Okay, moving on to item 11, public hearing. City Council's procedure for public hearings will be as follows. Staff will provide a report and clarification of items presented. The public hearing will be open for comments for those in favor of or in opposition to the item, followed by any rebuttal to any comments made. The public hearing will be closed and the city manager may respond to any questions raised by the public. The public will not have an opportunity to respond at that time. Discussion will then be brought back to the city council for direction or action. So, city manager, do we have a report from staff on this item?
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, we have Steve Larissa, our city engineer, who is queuing up the PowerPoint. I think he's got about 10 slides or so that he'll be presenting for this specific public hearing item.
Mayor, if was it working? Oh, it is working. I'm sorry. Mayor, I just would like to ask Ty, the machine's getting ready to restart, and I don't want that to happen.
Okay, while they're addressing that technical issue, again, Ms. Smith, I just want to reiterate that if you are still watching on the live stream, feel free to submit an email with your comments on the agenda item that you wanted to speak to, and we'll make sure that they get presented.
All right, Mayor, I'm going to get the slide started. The machine has to go through its process.
Electronic gremlins are alive and well tonight.
Sorry about that. All right. Good evening, Mayor, members of the council. This item, 11A, is for a resolution approving a modification to the conditions of approval for a particular parcel map number 37196, which is located at the northeast corner of Sanderson Avenue and Menlo Avenue. Just a little bit of background on this project site. Back in August 22nd, 2017, this project was approved as a parcel map as well as a CUP. The conditions of approval, among well over 200 conditions, one of them in particular was calling for the construction of this particular trapezoidal channel down here on the south portion here. This is Menlo and this is Sanderson. I'll go into a little more detail about that, but condition of approval number 103 called for the dedication of this land as well as the construction of that trapezoidal channel. Here's a little bit bigger blow up of the area, but again, here's the trapezoidal channel, Menlo Avenue, storm drain structure that would connect to the existing storm drain structure that travels to the west on Menlo, and then further on south. I wanted to point this picture out up here because the connection here from the storm drain goes directly into the existing storm drain. And the reason why that's important is that there's no weir structure there. There's no holding of water within these two facilities. It's a complete flow through. So a little bit more on the background. The drainage facilities within this area, and as I mentioned before and as everybody else knows, there's a lot of drainage facilities that are still needed to be done throughout. This is a picture from a slide from Riverside County Flood Control and Water Conservation District's master drainage plan. And to point out, this is the project site right here, and this dashed line right here is the boundary of two area drainage plans. So Riverside County Flood Control will put together a master drainage plan for a large area. We're currently working with them right now on an update to consolidate 4 of the city's master drainage plans into one. Within that, there are area drainage plans, and those are specific items, specific studies that identify things to be constructed. So anyway, reference again, project site right here. This red line here is line 2C, which is called to be an open channel, the trapezoidal channel. It also is then up here an 84-inch storm drain line. None of this stuff has been constructed yet. Once it goes into here, then goes on, and you may recall that this is identified as a Seattle street basin down over here, and then this is where it'll eventually get into Ramona Creek further on down the line. But none of these facilities are constructed yet. Here's where the trapezoidal channel would be constructed as in the condition of approval number 103. Here's the rest of the site. I point this out because this area over here, this land was dedicated as well. However, as part of that development, the trapezoidal channel was never constructed. Land is dedicated, just not constructed. Over here, the land has been dedicated as part of the parcel map. So why are we here? Working with the developer and understanding the site drainage characteristics as well as what the city needs to see, the community needs to see, we decided to look at the possibility of not having that trapezoidal channel constructed out there. Reason being is, one, it doesn't collect any of the runoff from the site. I'm going to point out over here. So all of the runoff, let me say the vast majority of the runoff, drains to the Sanderson and drains to the north. There's a little area down over